So Oda probably just gave us the biggest hint to the truth behind Haki that we've had pretty much in the entire story, because in One Piece chapter 1165, we saw what was likely the end of the legendary Rox D. Zebek, and after Garp and Roger traded several blows with Rox, including some pretty nifty combo attacks I might add, Roger told Garp that it was all about the mass, and because they wouldn't win in a battle of attrition with Demon Rox, they needed to channel all of their mass into their next attack and finish him off right then and there. And while I think Rox will probably get to at least have a few final words before he's gone for good, it does seem that this battle is for the most part over, thanks to them channeling all of their so-called mass. But what did Roger really mean by that? Well, the kanji that was used for mass here is the same that you would use if you were talking about mass in terms of physics, because as my high school physics teacher drilled into our heads, weight and mass may be related, but they are different things. Weight takes into account how much gravity a certain amount of mass is experiencing, which is why we would all weigh less on the moon than we do on Earth. And I believe that this is a very important distinction because Oda also used this same term when Vegapunk was discussing the mass that leaves the body when you die, aka the 21 grams of soul. And the 21 grams of soul is something that we've talked about a few times on this channel rather recently, specifically in regards to Imu's abilities in the underworld and such. But after this chapter, there's a whole lot more to say about it, because now it also seems that there is a definite connection between that soul and the strength of your Haki. And it's important to note that this is somewhat different than Big Mom's version of the soul, which was primarily just lifespan, and we'll dive more into that later. But this is specifically like the same soul that would theoretically go on to the afterlife if you died, as we saw with Brook. And so when it comes to Haki, I think we sort of vaguely already knew that the soul or one spirit had a role with Haki, at least to some degree, because Haki is tied to will or ambition. It's like your spirit kind of manifesting to boost your attacks, but now Oda is adding a bit more rhyme or reason to that, and it turns Haki into almost scientific in nature. And I think this could explain a lot of very important plot points going on right now, ranging not just from the future of Haki, but also to the Mother Flame, to Imu's powers, and even how the final war might go down. Because previously I mentioned in passing how Vegapunk's line about the soul might actually tie into the equation E equals mc squared, the equivalence between mass and energy. Because for one thing, in real life, this equation was credited to Einstein, who is obviously one of the main inspirations that Oda used to create Vegapunk, thus why he had Vegapunk introduce this idea to us specifically. And after chapter 1165, I think this actually matters even more than I thought previously, because mainly what that equation showed us was how much energy can be created per unit of mass. And this proved that it only took a very small amount of mass in order to create a ton of energy. And this is something that we unfortunately saw on display with the atomic bomb, where at least at Hiroshima, less than 1 gram of material was actually converted to energy, yet we know how devastating that explosion was. And Einstein also had an indirect yet pretty important role in the creation of the atomic bomb as well, which is something that Oda seems to be paralleling with Vegapunk as well, at least in regards to the Mother Flame and the destruction at Leloucia. It feels like all of these different story elements are now coming together into one point that tells us in very much the same way that small amounts of mass can be turned into incredible amounts of energy in the form of these bombs, it seems the same can be basically done with Haki. That's why Roger said they needed to put all their mass into it. They needed to convert or utilize more of their 21 grams of soul, so then they had more power to finish the fight right then and there. And I think it's kind of funny to think about all this in regards to Garp's galaxy impact on Hachinosu, because it literally looked like a nuke went off on that island. And back when that all happened, I think we were all just sort of in awe that Garp could create that much devastation. But now I think you can look at that almost as a big foreshadow of sorts, because Garp was the one asking about the mass during this fight versus Rox. And what's really interesting about this whole idea is that if everyone, regardless of their body size, had the very same 21 grams of soul, then that would sort of mean that everyone has the same latent potential within them. Now, that's not to say that having more mass in a physical sense isn't beneficial as well, kind of like how the giants have been built up to be this huge threat throughout the story because they're giant. Plus, there's definitely a reason that Gunko said whichever side the giants pick is going to change the outcome of the war, which is something we'll talk about later in the video. But I think the trope or idea that Oda's going for here is that since everyone everyone does have the same 21 grams of soul, they theoretically could have the same power output regardless of their size. It's just only those who train and push themselves and put it all on the line that can access the higher levels of it and convert more and more of that soul into power. This is also likely tied to why Haki blooms when you're near death. There's really no point in limiting yourself if the whole 21 grams is at risk anyway. And that also brings me to the Mother Flame, actually, because with that being the source of power that destroyed Lelucia, what are the chances that it's just made of somebody's soul? And then Vegapunk found a way to convert that to energy in much the same way that nuclear fission was used to create the atomic bomb. I mean, York even referred to that thing as a fusion reactor. Also, you know how the Mother Flame is fire that somehow burns in water? Or maybe it's another liquid, but regardless, it still kind of makes you wonder how that fire is staying alive. Well, we actually saw something pretty similar to that in the anime with Big Mom and Prometheus, which I think is pretty important because Prometheus is quite literally a soul-powered fireball. And this all happened back when Big Mom got knocked off the rooftop, because when Prometheus went to save her, the manga sure made it look like she was saved before falling in the water, but the anime showed Prometheus literally dive into the water and stay alive long enough to pull Big Mom out. This was one of those things that at the time I was kind of surprised they went that far, and I sort of assumed the anime was just having fun with it, but we know they do consult Oda on things quite often, so maybe this whole scene wasn't just a random throw-in from Toei, but what if Oda wanted to add that scene almost as a foreshadow for the Mother Flame? I mean, it would sort of make sense that the Mother Flame would tie to Big Mom and her flame, wouldn't it? Or maybe even Mother Carmel, who also had a living fireball powered by her own soul. I feel like there just has to be some connection between all of these different points. Now, the question that I'm wondering is, if the Mother Flame is someone's soul, then whose was it? Was it some random person, or was it some kind of lab rat, or did Vegapunk maybe break off part of his own soul? Because we know that Vegapunk already split up parts of his personality in order to create the satellites, and we heard that York broke off a fragment of the Mother Flame in order to do what happened at Lelucia, so maybe Vegapunk also split up his own soul into different fragments in order to create the satellites and the Mother Flame, which would also make the fact the satellites call themselves Vegapunk even more meaningful. Or if the Mother Flame isn't from any of those, then what if it is just Pandora? Now, I know we're kind of opening Pandora's box here, but we don't know what really happened to the thing after Mother Carmel got eaten, and we know that Vegapunk did visit Elbaf before, so maybe he took it back to study it and was able to somehow create a fusion reactor out of it. And like I mentioned earlier, Big Mom's powers are a bit different than the 21 grams of soul because hers is more like lifespan, but we still know there is an important connection between the two because of Brook. He was able to free the souls from the chest keeper homies that Big Mom had, and even cut Zeus in half. And we know that he has a tie to the 21 grams of soul because his soul literally went to the underworld and then back. And then that's how we connect this all back to Emu, because another thing that we've talked about a lot recently on this channel is how Emu's abyss powers almost have to tie to the underworld thanks to the pentagram circles, which Brook also saw during his time skip. There we learned that they were literally meant to summon Satan, and with how demonic everything else feels that relates to Emu, there definitely seems to be some underworld connection there. And that's why I've been promoting the idea recently that Emu is probably somehow just using other people's souls to power their attacks, almost like Big Mom in Lifespan or even Moria in his Shadows. And I think that idea takes on a whole new meaning if their soul is also the driver for Haki, because in other words, we might be able to say that Emu is also using or borrowing other people's Haki, or at least converting them into a usable form to boost their own Haki, I guess. Or maybe just another way of thinking about it is Emu has a ton of mass at their disposal because of the dead. This could also give a whole new meaning to their native cleansings, as they would almost act as a way for Emu to increase their ammo. It's almost like Moria with Shadow's Asgard, basically. And furthermore, chapter 1165 extrapolated on something that we've seen a few times throughout the story, which is combining your attacks to make them stronger and overwhelm the opponent. Dory and Brogy were probably the first notable example of this, and then Kaido and Big Mom did basically the same thing, and then Dory and Brogy did it again. Luffy, Bonnie, Sanji, and Frankie also did this to send Mars away in Egghead, and Luffy and Bonnie did the same to get Saturn off the ship. So I think there's a lot to say here about the importance of working together and making giant alliances, but I also think that Imu is probably tapping into the very same idea, but by forcefully using other people's souls to power themselves up, and this could be really important because unlike Roger or Garp, who said that they would be completely spent if they put all of their mass into it, Imu can probably use all of somebody else's mass and then just move on to the next no problem. That's sort of the advantage of having all these souls at their disposal. And this might just tell us a little bit about how Domi Reversi works in the first place. Because Gunkmu did say that thou shalt cast aside thy lifespan for a body unyielding to death, and that becoming a demon is truly the pinnacle of existence. So it seems that Imu is forcing them to burn through all of their lifespan quickly, but for a temporary power-up, and one in which Imu somehow gets to control them while they're like that. And exchanging some of your life for a temporary power-up is something we've seen throughout One Piece several times before, even going all the way back to Alabasta with the fatal fuel, if you guys remember that. But I think the best example that shares a lot of similarities with Domi Reversi is the Ice Oni virus that we saw during Wano. Because for one thing, they all look pretty demonic, very similar to the Domi Reversi transformation, I would say, which is especially weird considering how much the cold has been tied to ancient giants before, like the Gale Ra giants who were frozen, or Ors who was kept in a freezer, or Loki who was tied up in the realm of the dead. But Hyogoro even said that it drew out his dormant strength and that he gained power in exchange for his remaining life force. And in much the same way that they would lose control of themselves when the Ice Oni virus took full effect, it feels like the same thing's happening with Domi Reversi. Now, I'm not saying Domi Reversi is caused by a virus, but just there's an obvious parallel here. In fact, I bet Kaido got the idea for the Ice Oni virus from what happened at God Valley, or at least he told Queen this is what he wanted him to do, because Queen even told us that the point of these was basically to make use of all of their underlings that didn't get a smile transformation. Like, they knew full well that everyone would just die from this, but it at least kind of made them useful to them in the meantime, right? And since Chopper was the one who figured out the Ice Oni virus, I kinda think Chopper is gonna be the one to figure out Domi Reversi as well, because even Garp was asking in this chapter if there's some way to undo it, and remember Chopper was specifically the one wondering how regeneration works? Well, once this flashback's over, almost everyone's gonna go start fighting Imu probably, which will likely leave Chopper taking care of Scopper alone, so I wonder if Scopper will just start lore dumping everything about this to Chopper and he'll figure out how to undo all of this. And another thing that this all kind of reminds me of is Lao Ji, who basically did the opposite thing as the Ice Oni virus, where he basically saved all of his youthfulness or his energy or mass or however you want to put it until a later date so he could be strong when he's old. But Domi Reversi seems to kind of push all of that upward so you get a power up sooner rather than later. Or another thing that we should probably compare this to is the energy steroids, because not only did Hody and his gang get insane power ups from them, they became old afterward. It's like they sacrificed most of their lifespan for a temporary power up. So perhaps the steroids were engineered as like a last ditch counter to Domi Reversi, which is why everyone also kind of looks like they're in Gear 5th, where they all get white hair and red eyes and everything. And this could also be why the Tamate Bako was protected by the fishmen who were once allied with Joy Boy. But tying this all back to Imu, if Imu really is in control of the underworld and using other people's mass or their souls to power themselves, then you just gotta think, Imu probably has a ton of souls at this point. I mean, they have 800 plus years of mass at their disposal. And if that's true, then this might just give us a more literal reason why the world needs a huge alliance to work together to save the world, as we saw in the third world on the mural. It's all about whoever has the most mass. And I think this would also tie into Luffy's ability to bring people to his side. It would give Mihawk's line about this being the most dangerous ability on the seas even more credence, because the only way anyone could have a chance versus Imu is with a massive alliance where they're all fighting for the same cause. Now, I think it's also worth mentioning that I really doubt Oda's just gonna dumb this all down to just a simple numbers game, like whoever has more people on their side is gonna win just because there's more total grams of soul. But there's probably also gonna be a layer to it, as there are in most One Piece battles, where people need to be willing and able to use more of their soul or more of their haki at a given time. Because even if every single person has the same amount of latent power within them, it may not matter as much if you don't know how to use it. This is why earlier I mentioned that being physically bigger or physically stronger is still going to be a pretty big advantage, because if you don't count the few people who have maximized their haki or their mass, you could say, say, then being giant is still gonna be a huge advantage most of the time, because everyone might have the same ceiling, but not everyone has the same floor, and being giant is about as high of a floor as you could get. But despite that, if you train hard enough and believe in yourself, then even the smallest Tentada could be as strong as the biggest giant, which honestly might tell us a little bit about how Usopp can become a brave warrior of the sea, because not only does he tie to both the giants and Tentada very closely, which is fitting I think, but he's also been built up to be one of the physically weakest members of the crew, but during some of his fights he also doesn't mind to put his body on the line when push comes to shove. So maybe he will also put all of his mass into one attack and be completely spent afterward like Roger and Garp in order to stop a Domi Reversi giant in true David vs. Goliath fashion. And as far as why Gunko said that whichever side the giants choose will change the outcome of the war, I think part of that is certainly because of their physical mass, they're just going to do more damage in general, but a new creator by the name of Tiny Angry Gnome also pointed out to me that this is probably tied to their long lifespan, because even if everyone has the same amount of soul, not everyone has the same amount of lifespan, and the giants have more than anyone. They live 3 times as long as humans. So perhaps Domi Reversi is especially useful for Imu when it comes to the giants, because not only are they already huge, but the transformation might just last 3 times as long. But there's also a very, very important angle here that we need to talk about in regards to Blackbeard, because his powers work just like a black hole. He even said that it's infinite gravitation, so much so that even light can't escape. And that is literally the same logic as a real black hole. That's the reason that they're black in the first place. And the reason why they have so much gravity is because they have so much mass. They are pretty much more massive than anything else in the universe. So I think that's another hint that Blackbeard is gonna be like the perfect counter for Imu and these abyss powers, but also probably another hint that one of the 2 fruits that Rox was looking for was the Yami Yami, and this might be why Eris said that he wasn't ready yet. And I think Blackbeard's ability to touch the true body of the devil fruit user is important here as well, as that might tell us that the devil fruit powers themselves also have a mass somewhere in the person's body, which Blackbeard is then pulling in. Which reminds me of what Jabra said during Enies Lobby, because he said that if you eat a devil fruit, that means a devil lives inside your body. So maybe when you eat one, there's literally a second soul entering your body that grant all these different powers. And that would kind of make sense, as we already knew that zones had a will of their own, and even the way that Sabo said Ace won't forgive you after getting his fruit always made it feel like there was something deeper to it. But now, what does this all mean for the future of the One Piece story, I guess? Well, for one thing, this is all likely gonna tell us how conquerors can be used to stop the God's Knight's regeneration, as well as Imu and the Gorosei in general. Because Scopper said that you have to be mindful about using conquerors against them, and I think this either tells us that you need to make sure you're putting enough mass into your attacks to match them or surpass them, or at least you need to target their 21 grams of soul so it actually does more lasting damage. And I think this also tells us that in order to beat the Reversi giants, we will probably also need to do combo attacks. I mean, I could definitely see a situation where the monster trio teams up to take down Dory and Brogy as a way to almost bring their original combo attack full circle. This would also kind of be like a post-time skip version of the monster trio taking down a pacifista at Sabaody originally, and then maybe by the end of Elbaf, after some more training, the monster trio can take down the Reversied people alone, thus paralleling what we saw at Return to Sabaody. Now, I'm not sure if Dory and Brogy would actually die from this. We might learn more about this in chapter 1166 with the aftermath of the Rock situation, but fighting Dory and Brogy sure seems likely at this point, at least until we find a better way to cancel the abilities. And then one other thing that I think this all might end up tying to is actually the sacred trees of Skypiea, because they were said to house the souls of their ancestors, and while we still aren't sure exactly how true that is just yet, it would be pretty wild if it turns out that Nolan cutting those trees down actually meant that Shandora's ancestors became under Imu's control. Like maybe those trees were sort of a safe haven for those souls so they couldn't get taken by Imu, which would then make Kalgara's anger even more justified. And this would also lead me to wonder if the Eve tree has a role in all of this for Imu as well. Because if the trees in Skypiea are going to be like a safe haven for the souls, then maybe the Eve tree also holds souls, however whenever Imu is taking advantage of them. That might just be where Imu stores them until later use. And you know, with all this talk about the soul and how the line about mass might tie into that, there were a few weird things in this chapter that I think also adjacently tie to the soul and are worth bringing up, starting with the reveal that Gil Baster actually has the Horo Horo no Mi, because while those powers may not tie to the soul specifically, it does let one control ghosts, right? And those are pretty adjacent to the soul in the afterlife and the underworld and all that kind of stuff. But not only that, we also met Polo Graham in this chapter, and I gotta say, I was a huge fan of this reveal. I cannot believe the Marco Polo theories came true, but even more important than that, Marco obviously has the Phoenix fruit, and the legend behind the Phoenix is that they reincarnate after death. Both of these powers are like soul adjacent, and I'm starting to wonder if it's not a coincidence Oda brought them up in this chapter of all chapters. I've even been hearing theories that Polo Graham might actually be Marco, because maybe he had the fruit and then died and reincarnated as Marco, but Marco was already 7 by God Valley, so unless there's some really weird mechanics with that fruit, I don't think that's necessarily going to work. But regardless, I just find it kind of uncanny that all of these things were brought up in this chapter where the soul might have been a subtle focus. But either way, I love this chapter, as I have pretty much this entire flashback, so I can't wait to see what else Oda's cooking. So make sure to like and subscribe for future videos, but that's it for today, so until next time, later.